Welcome to this week's lecture. We're going to be focusing on historical empathy and the use of imagination in the classroom. And as we did last time, I'm going to focus first on some of the theoretical aspects of the topic and just try to unpick a little bit about what we mean when we use these terms and their place in thinking about history as an academic discipline. And in the second part of the lecture, we'll move on and think about some of the practical implications for the history classroom. So we'll start with some definitions. In Endicott and Brooks' reading from this week's reading list, they start with this definition, that historical empathy is the process of students' cognitive and affective engagement with historical figures in order to better understand and contextualise their lived experiences, decisions or actions. Historical empathy involves understanding how people from the past thought, felt, made decisions, acted and faced consequences within a specific historical and social context. So that seems to be a fairly kind of useful, practical starting point. Another way to look at this is from Peter Lee. He said the central idea here is that people in the past didn't all share our way of looking at the world. For this reason, when writing or reading history, we must understand the ideas, beliefs and values with which different groups of people in the past made sense of the opportunities and constraints that formed the context within which they lived and made decisions about what to do. So this gets at the real reason and also hints at one of the problems with this, that people in the past made decisions. We don't readily understand the context in which they made those decisions, or the way in which they perceived the implications of those decisions. So this is about trying to understand the decisions people made on their own grounds, really, so we can better understand their motivations. And as Lee goes on to suggest, but people in the past can appear to be strange, and sometimes they do peculiar things defined as things we wouldn't do or find difficult to understand. So it's not always easy for students to accord them respect. So Lee immediately starts to work backwards from this definition to say we can see that younger children especially will have a problem doing this, because we're asking them to understand as reasonable people in the past that if they met them today would be entirely unreasonable. And so that kind of suspension of judgment and that relativization and contextualization of how we make those kinds of judgments is a fairly big conceptual leap for young people to make. And then the third definition from Sean Lang, he poses it in these really kind of down-to-earth terms, I think. Until we really feel that we know the characters we study, how can anything they did make sense? It's this leap of thinking to get into the minds of the people we're studying, which constitutes the empathy, which is the hallmark of good historical understanding. So he puts it fairly and squarely in the centre of his definition of effective history. But there's clearly a problem here, and Peter Lee was hinting at it, and it's related in some senses to a general philosophical problem. This is an illustration taken from chapter 1 of an A-level philosophy textbook, and it just makes the point that philosophers have really pondered that although we can look on the same physical object, so you and I can look at a tree, we can't truly know what each other is seeing. I mean, we know that there's a shared object we look at, but if I say, the leaves are a beautiful shade of green, you'll agree. But it may be your experience of green is my experience of blue, but you've just learned culturally to refer to what I would see as blue as green. How do I know that although we've just got a shared language for describing green and greenness, that in our minds we associate it with exactly the same thing? So there's a general stretch of understanding exactly what it is we think we know that the other person is perceiving. We can't ever climb inside other people's minds and see the world exactly as they do. So we're always kind of taking it on trust, and we're using language as a mediating, kind of mediating layer, if you like, to characterize what those perceptions are. So there's a general kind of slightly abstracted philosophical problem, but we can perceive this in everyday politics. I mean, here's a picture of Merkel and Hollande representing France and Germany in the European Union having conversations with Putin about what's going to happen in Ukraine, about the rebels in Ukraine, supposedly working with or for the Russian government, and they're sitting around a table, they're having a conversation. They struck what appeared to be a ceasefire agreement, but within a week it's not happening. Now, these people are sat around a room in the same time, and they share a worldview in the sense that they represent their countries, they lead government, they understand how politics works. I would suggest it's very difficult for them sitting around having this conversation to truly perceive the conflict in the Ukraine as the others around this table perceive it. And it's certainly much discussed at the moment in the press as to the extent to which Putin is kind of being honest about his motivations and sharing the full information at that table. So even when you're sitting in a room with people with whom you have substantial similarities, there is always a huge amount of guesswork going on as to how you can make sense of their motivations and their worldview, and therefore second guess the kinds of judgments they would make and what those judgments mean to them. So there's a first problem about how we perceive other people's minds generally. So this is magnified when we take people in different contexts, such as in different periods of time. So here's an example that Chris Husbands uses in one of his books, just to illustrate the kind of thing that he saw in history classrooms. This is a print from Tudor England from the 16th century, showing a beggar being whipped in public for begging, and this is used to illustrate the impact of the poor laws at this period of time. And it might be a useful activity to ask children to empathise with the people in the picture, to develop a more of an emotional engagement and a sense of what's going on here and what does it mean for the people in this tableau. So Husband says that it wouldn't be unimaginable that a teacher would ask children to empathise with either the beggar, with the people in the crowd who are watching this whipping going on, or with the man with the whip, and to think about why do people do these things in the past. But he identifies three substantial challenges. The first is the challenge of verification. He says, really, if we did this in a class of 20 people and they all came up with different interpretations, by what criteria could we judge one student's response better than another? So he said it's so unhistorical in a sense that there's no right or wrong, there's no better or worse answer. We're just asking people to say, how do you think this person felt? And all we can do is acknowledge that's how the students think. There's also an evidential challenge here, that this is not a picture of a particular person being struck by a particular person for a particular reason. This is a general print which is created to demonstrate some aspect of life in Tudor Britain. So as Husbands describes it, it's not a portrayal of an individual, actual historical figure, it's an archetype. And it was produced for a purpose, and it doesn't really provide any insight into any real person's life. And then thirdly, there's the historical challenge, which is there's always this gap between the mind and the perception of the other, and the further back we go in time, simply the more unbridgeable that gap is. So there are some convincing reasons here why this is a really problematic area of history. But Husbands goes on to say, despite that, there are some grounds for wanting to defend empathy in the history classroom and in history as a discipline, in a broader notion of history as a creative subject. And his case rests on the following arguments. He says some postmodern accounts of history as a discipline focus on history as in a sense a form of fiction. And he says here the very act of writing a single account of a complex and unknowable world requires a degree of fictionalization. And the conventions of historical writing, actually, when you investigate it, share much with the conventions of literature. This has been developed by people like Hayden White, who have developed an argument that what historians are doing is essentially constructing more or less fictional narratives that string together facts about the world, and they use the literary convention of metaphors to try and string these ideas together into accessible stories. So there is a strand in postmodern accounts of how we construct history and how we construct historical accounts which acknowledges that it's essentially a language mediated storytelling activity, and therefore it's not as divorced from the notion of creativity and imagination as we might first think. Secondly, Husband says we need to use our imagination to formulate hypotheses, and then we test those hypotheses against the sources. And that's the way that history is really constructed, that it's not take the evidence, sift through all the evidence, and then see what conclusions you can draw, that there's always a kind of a reciprocal relationship. And first of all, we're likely to develop hypotheses, then we test it against the information we discover, we refine the hypotheses, and we maybe go and look for different types of evidence. So there is this very creative sense or creative force required in order to develop and formulate and refine hypotheses. And then finally, he says that if we think about the role of history, we do need some form of emotional engagement in history in order to build on its potential for moral reflection and moral reasoning, this idea of how and why we do history and what purpose it has for us from our current standpoint. So in the literature, Endicott and Brooks point out, and several other people use these related bits of terminology, that sometimes people talk about historical empathy, but also people talk about perspective taking and perspective recognition, rational understanding or contextual understanding, and historical imagination. So there are different terms coming together under this very broad and rather loose idea of historical empathy. And Husband says that receptiveness to the experiences and the assumptions of historical actors is critical and provides an initial control on the liberation of imagination in the construction of historical understanding. So this is like the antidote to worrying too much about historical imagination. He says the important thing is that we're using that imagination but constrained by the evidence, and therefore that reciprocal relationship between evidence and imagination is the important thing, and it stops us dissolving history into pure fiction or flights of fancy. So if we unpick it, then we get to these two dimensions. We get the cognitive dimension, which is drawing on historical knowledge and understanding about the conditions in which people lived and acted, but there's also this additional affective or emotional dimension, which enables us to identify with how people may have felt in those circumstances. And taken together, we hope that these will gain insight or give us insight into the history questions relating to how and why. So we can describe what through just a trawl through the sources, but when we get into the bigger questions of how something happened in that way and why it happened in that way, inevitably we have to engage in some measure of cognitive and affective reasoning, which combined lead us down the pathway of having to empathise to some extent with people in the past. Now, I think the other thing that's important here is that relates to a very strong sense of time, in the sense of developing a feeling for the period. So in the very first lecture we talked about how people characterise time, and one of the ways in which historians have to understand time is to develop an increasingly deep and nuanced sense of a period, and to know and to understand the character of that period, the ideas and beliefs that motivate people in that period and make that period of time distinctive. So we also need to put that into the mix here, and it draws in large part on that as a cognitive dimension of historical understanding. So why would we teach empathy then? We can start to see a number of different strands coming together here. The first is, this is the teacher in me that thinks this is the most important thing, because engaging with history empathetically can improve pupil motivation. Thinking about people, individuals and their reasoning and relationships is simply a motivating way to unpack complex historical concepts. But secondly, it enables us to be more genuine in our search for understanding people and their actions historically. That is to say, in the context in which they made them. It also enables us to begin to make judgments, and to make fairer judgments, rather than just transferring our own sense of morality back in the past, and we can begin to use history in more nuanced and meaningful ways to inform our current judgments. It enables us to contribute to fostering this deeper sense of period of time, or of a period of time, and it also encourages us to dissolve this myth that there is a group of people in the past and they all felt like this, that taking empathy seriously enables us to develop a multi-perspectivity approach to history, so that we begin to understand that different people in different periods of time had different views, and we use the evidence to illustrate that. Now, we return week after week to this Project Chatter research because it's just very useful, I think. This is their model in relation to historical empathy or rational contextual understanding. So on the left hand side you can see their kind of 6 scales, but on the right hand side I think is the easy to characterize description of how children develop empathy over time. The first level, if you like, is simply that children have deficit views of the past. They think people in the past did weird things because they were stupid or they were ignorant, or that they're just being judged from today's perspective, and they're often found wanting from that perspective. We move then into a slightly higher level where we start to stereotype groups of people, and we just say, well, this group of people behave like this, the Catholics behave like this, or the Germans behave like this, or the Japanese were motivated by this factor, and we lump everyone in together. And then the next part of that simplification process, we just project ourselves back in time, and we imagine that we are those people, but we are unchanged in that historical position. So that's an improvement on the first levels, but it doesn't get you very much further. And only towards the higher end, and the Chatter researchers would say towards the end of secondary school, really, you start to see this more routinely. Do you get the penny dropping moment that children begin to take the past on its own terms, and therefore try to understand people's motivation by imagining what it was to make sense of the world on its own terms. And then the final phase, with reference to forms of life, is to understand that there are cultural, ideological, religious worldviews that completely transform the kinds of decisions that confronted people in those periods of time. So a huge kind of developmental gap to bridge between very young children who have these naive views of history and historical motivation, and moving up to a more sophisticated level. So it's clearly difficult, but as Philip says, if history teaching is not at the very least about trying within those constraints to show children what the otherness of the past was really like, then what is it about? So it's a huge cognitive challenge, it's a developmental challenge, but history teachers through time have argued that it's one that's really worth engaging with, because at the heart of it, this is what we want history to contribute to young people's education. So these are some of the references for the people that I've discussed in this part of the lecture. In the second part, we'll go on and think about, so what does a history teacher practically do to rise to that challenge and to unpick some of those complexities.